14-year-old Maya, drenched and trembling, clutching a soggy cardboard sign no one dares to read. What begins with a gentle question, "Are you okay?" spirals into a gripping three-day fight to save a dying dog and protect the only thing Maya has left, hope. In a city of 700,000, two strangers collide, and one act of compassion could shake the entire system to its core. What will become of Maya and her dog when the world only watches from behind glass? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Washington, D.C. didn't sleep. At 10 p.m., the Capitol pulsed with power beneath the marble shadows of its monuments. Black SUVs rolled past lit government buildings, engines humming like quiet threats. On the corner of Pennsylvania Avenue, a private dinner had just wrapped inside the Hamilton, a sanctuary for lobbyists, donors, and those who moved legislation with whispers and wine. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, clad in a slate black suit that matched her reputation for sharp words and sharper instincts, stepped out beneath the gold-trimmed awning. Cameras had stopped flashing. Her driver opened the door. Then she froze. Just 6 feet away on the rain-slicked sidewalk sat a girl, small, soaked, and silent. Her frame curled inward, clutching a handwritten sign that was smudged beyond recognition. No one looked at her. Not one of the powerful guests who had just spoken about opportunity for all. They stepped over her like she was a stain on the street. Jasmine didn't move. The air shifted. There was something unbearable in the girl's posture. Not just cold or hunger, but resignation, like she'd already accepted the world had no use for her. A passing couple tightened their coats and sped up their steps. One man muttered, "Another one," as if homeless children were weeds on the Capitol lawn. Jasmine's heart pounded, but not from fear. It was rage. This city spent billions on optics, while this child sat invisible outside a building serving $300 steaks. And still, the girl didn't beg. She didn't even raise her eyes until Jasmine stepped closer. In that one glance, Jasmine saw everything: exhaustion, loss, defiance. It was the look of someone too young to give up but too battered to believe. She knelt slowly, ignoring her silk pants and the rain-soaked pavement. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice calm but firm, like a hand reaching into a fire, unsure if she'd pull out ash or a flicker of something still alive. And in that exact moment, surrounded by men in $1,000 suits and women wrapped in silk and influence, Jasmine Crockett, battle-hardened from the halls of Congress, chose not to move up the ladder of power, but to step down into the rain, into the silence, into the story no one else dared to notice. The girl didn't speak, not right away. Her shoulders trembled beneath her damp hoodie, not from cold, but from the weight of something she was clearly carrying alone. She glanced at Jasmine, then quickly looked away, as if ashamed to have been seen. The street behind them throbbed with life, headlights streaking past, snippets of laughter from drunk lobbyists down the block, a siren howling somewhere in the distance. But here, on this sliver of wet concrete, everything had slowed. Jasmine crouched lower, still meeting the girl's eye level, her breath rising in steady puffs against the night air. Finally, after an excruciating pause, the girl's lips parted. Her voice was paper-thin, dry and trembling. "I need help, but I can't say it out here." Her eyes weren't scared. They were calculating, watching, measuring. Not if Jasmine was safe, but whether the world she represented could be trusted with truth. Jasmine recognized that look. It was the same one she'd worn the night she stood up to a system that told her to sit down. This wasn't a child begging. This was someone resisting surrender. Without a word, Jasmine extended her hand. Not a politician's handshake, a gesture of quiet urgency, the kind you only offer when you know the next few minutes might matter for the rest of someone's life. The girl hesitated, then nodded faintly, took Jasmine's hand with a grip firmer than expected, and rose. They walked in silence past empty storefronts and flickering neon, the city towering over them like it didn't care who lived or died on its sidewalks. 3 blocks later, Jasmine pushed open the door to a corner diner. Low ceilings, scratched booths, the smell of burnt coffee and old secrets. The heater buzzed overhead like a broken promise, but it was warmer than outside. The waitress raised an eyebrow, but said nothing when Jasmine gestured for the back corner. They slid into a booth with cracked red vinyl seats. Jasmine removed her coat but kept her tone quiet and direct. Let's start simple. What's your name? The girl didn't answer. She just stared at the salt shaker, as if it might offer advice. Jasmine watched her carefully. This wasn't shyness. It was defense, like someone who'd told the truth before and been punished for it. The silence stretched. Finally, Jasmine softened her voice, not to coax, but to level the field. You said you didn't run away to hide, she said. You said you ran to save someone. The girl's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. She looked up. No more wavering. Yeah, she said, but he's not who you think. Jasmine leaned in, her voice barely above a breath. Then tell me. The girl drew a slow inhale. Her voice didn't shake this time. I ran to save my little brother, she said, and then paused. But he's not human. Jasmine didn't flinch, but something deep inside her stilled. The girl's words weren't just a twist. They were a wound, freshly reopened. And Jasmine, who had faced senators, billionaires, and the brutality of televised hearings, suddenly found herself face to face with something far more disarming. Quiet, lived truth. The girl lowered her gaze, her fingers tracing invisible patterns on the vinyl table, as if trying to summon the courage to unearth something she had long buried beneath silence. His name's Toby, she said, the syllables falling out like a secret too heavy to hold any longer. He's my dog, my brother, my last anything. Jasmine didn't interrupt. She recognized the cadence, not just of grief, but of restraint. This wasn't a story the girl told often. It was one she had held tight, clutched to her chest like a photo you reread until the ink fades. He came on my 7th birthday, the girl continued, right after dinner. It was snowing a little outside, not much, just enough that everything looked silver. Her voice turned almost dreamlike, distant, like she was narrating someone else's life. We'd just gotten home. My dad told me to open the front door, and there he was, shivering, wet, just waiting. This scrawny black and white puppy with the biggest ears I'd ever seen. My mom wrapped him in her coat and said, "Looks like he picked you, birthday girl." She paused, eyes blinking hard but refusing to let tears fall. Jasmine could feel the weight in the air now, thick, like humidity before a thunderclap. They called him a miracle, a sign. My mom believed in stuff like that, meant to be moments. Toby was one of them. He followed me everywhere, slept at my feet, nibbled on my shoelaces. He made the house loud and alive. He was family, not like family. Family. Her voice turned low then, almost hollow, like someone peering down a well that never ends. 2 months later, everything changed. My parents were on their way to pick me up early from school. We were going to surprise my grandma for her birthday. I remember waiting by the front office with my backpack already zipped. Then I remember the principal walking in with a police officer. She wouldn't look at me when she said my name. A long silence. The truck hit them head on. Driver was drunk. No seatbelt. My mom died on impact. Dad made it to the hospital, but only for an hour. She didn't cry, but her hand clenched tightly around the spoon on the table, white-knuckled, the metal trembling softly against the edge of the saucer. Toby didn't understand, of course. He kept running to the front door, waiting, scratching at it every evening at the same time they used to come home. After a while, he just stopped eating, unless I sat beside him. He started sleeping in their closet, wouldn't bark, wouldn't move unless I moved. Jasmine felt her throat tighten. Her mind reached for words, but there were none that wouldn't sound hollow in the face of this kind of devastation. I was sent to live with my uncle, the girl went on, her tone hardening like the shell she had clearly learned to wear. He's my dad's older brother, always been angry, always said my dad was the weak one for marrying someone who worked with animals instead of someone who made money. When I showed up with Toby, he looked at me like I was carrying a dead rat, not a dog. Jasmine's pulse quickened. He told me on day one, that mutt stays outside. You feed it, clean it, and don't come crying when it disappears. The girl's voice turned sharper now, less haunted, more defiant. I tried to keep quiet. I followed every rule. I stayed out of the house when he got drunk, which was most nights. I fed Toby with the scraps I could steal from the fridge. I made a bed for him in the shed using my old blankets. He was cold, but he stayed. The injustice in her tone now had weight, like bricks being laid one by one into a wall no child should have had to build. Every time Toby barked, even just once, my uncle would pound on my bedroom door and scream, "One more noise and he's gone." He started keeping a leash by the back door, not to walk Toby, to drag him to the pound. She swallowed hard, her expression tightening like she was bracing herself against another blow. And then 2 weeks ago, Toby stopped eating, like before. I knew something was wrong. He wasn't barking, wasn't walking right. He was shaking, dry heaving. I tried giving him rice, broth. Nothing worked. Then he started vomiting. Yellow stuff. Then blood. She finally looked up, straight into Jasmine's eyes, and her voice, though soft, was the strongest it had been all night. My mom used to be a vet tech. She always said, when an animal stops eating, pay attention. When they start throwing up and getting weak, it might be a blockage. Could be fatal. I remembered that. Jasmine leaned in, breath caught. I told my uncle, begged him to take us to a vet. You know what he said? The girl gave a dry laugh without any humor. It's a dog, not a child. Let it die. Problem solved. Her fingers trembled again, this time from suppressed rage, not fear. So I waited until he passed out, took Toby, took my backpack, and ran. She exhaled sharply, as if saying it out loud confirmed that she really had crossed the line of no return. We slept under a bridge the first night. I had a towel from school and a bottle of water. I held Toby against my chest and tried to keep him warm. I thought I'd find a free clinic. I thought someone might help. But everywhere I went, they wanted money, paperwork, proof of ownership. I have none of that. Just memories. The weight of those final two words, just memories, landed hard. Jasmine didn't realize her own hands had curled into fists until her nails dug into her palm. She'd faced down CEOs who stole from veterans, judges who traded justice for favors, and lobbyists who lied through bleached smiles. But none of them, not one, had ever made her feel the kind of raw, helpless anger this child's story did. I wasn't running away from home, the girl said, her voice steel now. I was running towards something, towards saving something. I wasn't going to let him die on a concrete floor because some man couldn't be bothered to care. Jasmine didn't speak. Not yet. Words would come. But in that moment, there was only one truth. The world had failed this child over and over again. And somehow she still chose love, chose loyalty, chose to carry a fragile, dying creature across a city that had already abandoned her. And now she sat across from a woman who had once promised herself she'd never walk past injustice, even when the cameras weren't rolling. Especially then. Jasmine was already on her feet. Where is he now? She asked. The girl rose too, fast and focused. Not far, 5 blocks. I didn't know where else to take him. I found a dry spot behind a mechanic shop. I wrapped him in my hoodie, gave him the last of the water. They moved through the cold like shadows, Jasmine leading with long, determined strides, the girl guiding her with a child's desperate compass. The city didn't care. Its neon lights blinked indifferently. A bus whooshed by, showering them in a fine mist. Somewhere nearby, a man shouted into a phone. None of it mattered. Behind a dumpster, in the filth and forgotten corners of the nation's capital, lay a creature barely hanging on to breath. Toby. His frame was curled tightly, as if trying to disappear into himself. His ribs were visible through thinning fur. His eyes fluttered open and closed, slow and sluggish. A wet cough rattled his chest. Jasmine knelt slowly, setting her coat beneath him. She touched his side gently. It was hot, taut, and quivering. He's in crisis, she muttered. He won't last the night. The girl crouched beside her, arms wrapped around herself like armor against the cold and everything worse. I didn't know what else to do, she said, voice cracking for the first time. I tried. I fed him from my hand. I warmed him with my body. I couldn't let him die in that house. Jasmine reached out and pulled Toby into her arms like she would a wounded child. He didn't resist. He barely moved. His heartbeat was faint. erratic. "Get in the car," Jasmine said. "Now!" They drove like the city was chasing them. Jasmine's hands clenched the wheel at 10 and 2, eyes fixed ahead like a laser. The girl sat beside her, clutching Toby's body in the blanket, whispering his name with every bump in the road. "Stay with me, Toby. Stay!" Her voice was hoarse with hope and panic. "You're stronger than this. Just hang on." The veterinary emergency clinic loomed ahead, an aging building with a flickering sign and too much silence. Jasmine didn't wait for instructions. She kicked the car door open, marched into the lobby with Toby cradled like a newborn, and slammed her congressional ID down on the counter. "He needs surgery," she said, voice like steel. "Now!" The receptionist blinked in stunned silence. Jasmine didn't wait for her to respond. "This dog is dying. Internal obstruction, probable sepsis. And if you make us wait for intake paperwork or a deposit, I'll shut this entire place down by morning." The words weren't a threat. They were a verdict, a promise made from the depths of a woman who had built her career dismantling the machinery of neglect. Behind the desk, a vet tech rushed to the door. "Bring him!" she shouted toward the rear hallway. Two more techs appeared, rolling a gurney. Jasmine laid Toby gently across it. "Careful, his abdomen is rigid. He's slipping fast." They rushed the gurney down the corridor. The doors flung shut behind them. The girl stood motionless in the center of the lobby, arms still curved around the air where Toby had been just moments ago. "I don't know if I waited too long," she said quietly. Jasmine turned to her, placed a hand on her shoulder. Not soft, not coddling, but firm, resolute. "You didn't wait," she said. "You acted, when no one else would." The girl blinked, but she didn't speak. Her hand fell slowly to her side, fingers trembling like the last ember of a fire not quite gone out. They had handed over a life, not a file, not a case, but a living, dying fragment of love. And now, as the doors swung shut behind the veterinary team, the weight became unbearable. And when the vet finally returned, the look on his face told them everything. The clock had already started ticking. He walked out wearing gloves still streaked with iodine and urgency, his scrub top damp at the chest. There was no clipboard smile, no pause to soften the truth. "The dog's in bad shape," he said, voice flat but heavy. "There's a hard obstruction in his intestine. Feels like plastic or cloth. He hasn't passed anything in at least 48 hours, maybe longer. He's severely dehydrated. His body's starting to shut down." The girl stood like a statue, gripping the edge of the reception desk as if it were the last stable surface in a world tilting around her. "Is he going to die?" she asked, her voice barely audible, almost apologizing for the question. The vet exhaled slowly, but his words were brutal. "If we don't operate immediately, yes." Jasmine inhaled through her nose, slow and sharp, like preparing for battle. "Then operate," she said. "No question. No delay." The vet hesitated, looking between the girl and the woman whose presence suddenly felt like courtroom thunder. "The procedure's complicated," he said. "It requires anesthesia, a sterile team, overnight ICU. It's going to run into the thousands." Jasmine stepped forward, her voice rising, not in volume, but in force. "And?" The man blinked. "Well, most families. There's usually a payment discussion before." Jasmine cut him off with a single slicing sentence. "You're not going to let a child watch the last thing she loves bleed out over a billing form." The silence after that was nuclear. Even the receptionist, who had been typing something without purpose, froze mid-keystroke. "I'll cover the cost," Jasmine continued, her tone hard enough to crack marble. "Run the surgery. Bill me. I don't care what it takes. Save him." The girl's mouth fell open, but no words came out. Her hand hovered in the air, as if reaching for something she never believed existed. Intervention, mercy, hope. Jasmine didn't look at her. She didn't have to. Her focus was on the vet now, like a lawyer locking in on a judge. That dog is family. That child is not disposable. And if you delay one more minute talking about numbers, I'll ensure your license is reviewed by morning." The vet didn't argue. He gave a single curt nod and turned sharply on his heel, calling out for prep, anesthesia, saline. The door swung open. The gurney rolled through. The curtain dropped behind it, And just like that, the fight for Toby's life had begun. The gurney disappeared through swinging doors, swallowing the fragile life they'd fought to protect. In its wake, only silence remained, until the girl sank into a plastic chair, her arms curled around the empty blanket, like it still held the heartbeat of someone she couldn't afford to lose. She didn't speak for a long time, just sat there, head bowed, staring at the floor like it might open and swallow her whole. But then, in a voice that barely cracked the hum of the fluorescent lights, she said, "My mom used to work in a place like this." Jasmine turned slightly, listening, not pressing, just present. The girl's hands tightened around the fabric in her lap. She wasn't a vet. She never had the money for school. But she was a tech. Night shifts, weekends, holidays. She knew how to calm animals with just her hands, like magic. Her throat hitched, but she kept going, her words rolling out like a dam finally breaking. She'd bring me along sometimes, quietly. I'd sit in the back, watch her clean wounds, hold dogs that were too scared to breathe. She used to whisper to them, said animals never pretend to hurt. They only pretend to be okay. That's why they need people who listen. She paused, her voice cracking on the next line. I keep thinking, if she were still here, Toby wouldn't be like this. I would have known what to do sooner. He wouldn't have suffered. Jasmine didn't interrupt. The girl's fist curled tighter. After she died, no one talked about her. Not my uncle. Not anyone. Like she'd been erased. I tried to remember what she taught me. I wrote it all down in a notebook. But I lost it when we left the house. I lost everything. Her chest heaved, but she refused to cry. I know I'm just a kid. I know no one's going to hand me anything. But I wanted to help. I wanted to save him. And I still might lose him anyway. Jasmine leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees, eyes locked on the girl like nothing else existed in the world. You didn't lose her, she said. You carried her here, in your hands, in every decision you made when everyone else gave up. That's not failure. That's legacy. The girl looked up, and in her eyes was a kind of disbelief, hope twisted with fear. Jasmine's voice grew firmer. When I was your age, I didn't have much either. My mom cleaned offices at night. I used to sleep on the floor behind her mop cart because we couldn't afford a sitter. I wore the same shoes for 2 years, the same coat for 3. Kids made fun of me for how I smelled, for how I talked, for dreaming too loud. She took a breath, not to pause, but to steady the storm in her own chest. I told someone I wanted to be a lawyer. You know what they said? Girls like you don't win cases, you wait tables for the men who do. And when I said I wanted to be in Congress, they laughed like I'd told a joke that would never end. Jasmine leaned closer. Her voice didn't rise, but it deepened, sharpened, until each word struck like a gavel. But I didn't stop, because somewhere deep inside I knew that if I ever got power, I wouldn't use it to be above people. I'd use it to stand beside the ones who've been stepped over their entire lives. The girl stared at her. No more doubt, no more deflection, just silence carved with awe. I want to be a vet, she said suddenly, not whispered, declared. Like my mom, I want to help animals. I want to make it mean something. Her voice cracked again, but it didn't collapse. But I don't know if anyone will ever believe I can. Jasmine nodded slowly. You don't need everyone to believe, she said. You just need one person to start. She placed her hand gently over the girl's. And I do. The girl didn't answer. But the way she gripped Jasmine's hand, tightly, desperately, said everything she couldn't yet say out loud. The flicker of hope the girl had just begun to trust was snatched back into suspense as the doors burst open once more. This time, with the weight of life and death riding behind them. And Jasmine knew before the vet even spoke, something had shifted. The vet's face told half the story before his words even landed. Sweat beaded near his temples, and the urgency in his stride was sharpened now, refined into clinical finality. He's crashing, he said. Dehydration, fever. His oxygen dropped twice while we stabilized him. The girl froze in her seat, her knuckles turning white against the armrest. He's barely strong enough for surgery, the vet continued. If we wait, he dies. But if we take him in now, there's a chance his heart won't make it past the incision. Jasmine stood, calm but electrified. You said chance. she said. The vet nodded. Yes, it's a razor's edge, and we need consent now. He held out the form like it was a weapon and a prayer in one. This waives our liability, he said. Surgery is high risk. He could arrest, bleed out. We won't have time to call you if that happens. Once he's under, it's all in the hands of the table. The girl looked up at Jasmine, her lips trembling but locked tight, like any sound would collapse her. Jasmine met the vet's eyes, and her voice, when it came, was as unwavering as steel being forged. Where do I sign? The clipboard hit the counter. The pen slid across without a word. Jasmine signed not with desperation, but with purpose. Her name etched across the paper like a final wall between the girl and another unbearable loss. As she handed it back, the girl reached out and took her hand, not with the fragility of a child, but the intensity of someone hanging off a ledge with no harness. Jasmine didn't flinch. She squeezed back. He's not going down without a fight, she said softly, not as comfort, but as command. The vet turned without another word and disappeared through the swinging metal doors, which closed behind him with a sound that felt too final, too loud. And then came the wait. Not the kind padded by music or distractions, but the raw, oxygenless kind. The girl sat beside Jasmine, shoulders folded inward, eyes fixed on nothing. Every breath sounded too loud, too fast. The room was still, but her world was spinning. The hands of the clock on the far wall moved like a slow-motion pendulum, ticking in sync with her heartbeat, and each tick was a countdown she couldn't stop. A cough echoed down the hallway. A nurse passed through, didn't make eye contact. Jasmine stared ahead, unmoving, every fiber in her body alert, but calm, like the eye of a storm that refused to break. No one spoke. There was nothing to say. There was only time, and the impossible weight of waiting for it to end. Time had twisted itself into something cruel, each second heavier than the last, until the doors finally creaked open again, and the vet stepped out. This time he wasn't carrying fear. He was carrying something rarer, fragile, trembling, hope. He pulled off his gloves one finger at a time, his eyes scanning the room until they found the girl and settled there. He's alive, he said, and the words hit like oxygen. We found a blockage, thread, some kind of plastic tie, maybe from a toy or a food wrapper. It was coiled around itself, cutting off everything. His intestines were bruised, inflamed. He was minutes away from rupture. The girl blinked slowly, as if afraid her ears had deceived her. But he made it? She asked, her voice almost inaudible. The vet nodded. He's still with us, but he's very weak. We've got him on fluids, antibiotics. He'll be in pain when he wakes up. It'll be 2 weeks before he's stable enough to go anywhere. And even then, he'll need care. Constant, gentle, no stress, no trauma. If we give him that, he has a real chance. The girl lowered her face into her hands, not crying, just folding, like her body had finally run out of ways to carry the fear. Jasmine stood beside her, one hand resting gently on her back. But before she could speak, the girl's voice broke through the quiet like a blade through silk. I can't take him home. Her words weren't dramatic. They were resigned, final. My uncle. He'll say this proves I can't be trusted, that I'm reckless, that I wasted everyone's time. She looked up and her eyes had changed. The terror was deeper now. He'll say I've made Toby weak, that I've ruined him, and then he'll tell me to choose, him or me. And I can't do that. Jasmine knelt, slowly, deliberately, so she could look the girl in the eye, not from above, but beside. You won't have to, she said, and her voice carried no hesitation, only steel. You're not going back there. Not now, not ever. The girl's breath caught. But I don't have anywhere else. Jasmine shook her head. You didn't, she said. Until tonight. The girl blinked hard, shoulders trembling. You don't get it, she whispered. Nobody ever keeps me. They take me because someone makes them. Foster parents, caseworkers, teachers. I'm just part of their job. Her fists clenched. They always act like they care, but then they give up. They always do. Jasmine's jaw tightened. I'm not them. She said it with such force that even the air between them seemed to pause. You fought to save Toby when you had nothing. No money, no backup, not even a safe place to sleep. And now it's my turn to fight for you. Her voice softened just slightly, but not her resolve. You saved his life. That matters. You matter. I will find somewhere safe. Somewhere real. Not another room with locked cabinets and people who forget your name after a week. A place that sees you. All of you. The girl didn't speak. Her lip quivered, but she held it tight. And then slowly, so slowly, she reached for Jasmine's hand and squeezed it like a thread pulled taut between despair and something she didn't yet know how to believe in. Belonging. She had made a promise. And in Jasmine Crockett's world, promises weren't made to comfort. They were made to be delivered, even if the system fought her every inch of the way. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Jasmine stepped out into the hallway, her phone already in her hand like a drawn weapon. Her heels clicked against the linoleum floor with purpose, slicing through the sterile silence of the clinic like declarations in a courtroom. She didn't call a shelter. She didn't call child services. She called Ava Martinez, a woman who didn't blink at trauma, who didn't flinch from broken things. Ava ran a nonprofit in rural Maryland known as the Haven Line Project, a sanctuary for children with no one left and animals that had been thrown away twice over. Jasmine didn't waste time with greetings. She's 12, she said into the phone. Ran away to save her dog, slept in alleyways, watched him almost die in front of her, and she still walked into that clinic like a soldier. She doesn't need pity, she needs placement. Fast. There was silence on the other end. Jasmine knew Ava was already calculating personality, compatibility, crisis layers, grief density. Then her voice came low and unwavering. We've got one open home. It's not temporary. It's not a bed for the weak. It's the Pierces, Vietnam-era vet, wife's a retired animal behaviorist, 10 acres, fenced, quiet. They lost their daughter 3 years ago and swore they'd never foster again until they started working with rescue animals. Jasmine's throat tightened. Would they take her? Another pause, then, if she's who you say she is, they'll open the gate tonight. Jasmine didn't thank her. She just said, send me the address. She returned to the waiting room like someone carrying classified orders from the front lines. The girl looked up, eyes wide, as if afraid the moment would vanish before it began. You were gone a long time, she said, trying to sound neutral, but her voice cracked halfway through. Jasmine knelt in front of her again, the way she had the night before, eye level, heart forward. There's a place, she said, not a shelter, a real home, a family with dogs, land, and quiet. They don't do charity, they do trust. They take in survivors. You and Toby would be the first kid-dog pair they've accepted in over a year. The girl blinked hard. Her breath caught. Will I have to explain everything again, she asked, voice trembling under the weight of 100 traumas. Jasmine shook her head slowly. They already know enough. And what they don't, they'll let you share on your time. No files, no labels, just healing. The girl's hand reached for Jasmine's jacket, clutching it without looking. And Toby? She whispered. Jasmine answered with the weight of a judge's gavel. Where you go, he goes. That's the rule now. The girl looked down, but not in shame. This time, it was disbelief unraveling into something more dangerous, something sacred, hope. The road that brought them here wasn't long in miles, but in meaning, it stretched for lifetimes. And as Jasmine pulled onto the gravel driveway, past open fields and barking joy, she glanced in the rearview mirror and saw it in the girl's eyes. Awe, laced with fear. The house rose ahead like a painting too gentle to be real. White siding kissed by the late afternoon sun, a wide porch with peeling railings that somehow made it feel even more lived in. A hammock swayed lazily between two trees. A wind chime rattled softly in the breeze. But what stole the girl's attention, what made her stiffen in her seat, were the dogs. 5 of them, maybe 6, scattered across the wide green yard. Not leashed, not chained, running, barking, tails high. They played like creatures who had forgotten cages ever existed. Jasmine stepped out first and opened the back door slowly, letting the moment breathe. "Take your time," she said gently, watching the girl's knuckles whiten around Toby's crate. The girl stepped out onto the gravel, each motion cautious, as if the ground might collapse if she moved too fast. Her eyes darted from the porch to the open field to the woman walking down the front steps. Mid-60s, sun-browned hands, hair in a loose braid. She didn't speak right away, just knelt beside the crate and peered through the mesh. "He's a fighter," the woman said softly, "but I imagine he had help." She looked up at the girl, who stood frozen like a soldier who couldn't drop her armor. Then a man appeared in the doorway, quiet, built like a retired Marine with gentle eyes. He nodded once, and even that felt like a welcome. The girl turned to Jasmine, her voice barely more than breath. "Is this really for me?" she asked, the words trembling with more than disbelief. They were laced with years of learned rejection. Jasmine didn't hesitate. She knelt beside her, looked her square in the eye. "Not everyone gets a second chance," she said, voice clear and unshakable. "But you didn't wait for one to fall into your lap. You fought for it. You bled for it. And now you've earned it." The girl blinked hard, her throat moving like she was trying to swallow a lifetime of doubt. She looked back at the porch, at the dogs, at the people who weren't reaching to fix her, just to receive her. Her grip on the crate loosened for the first time, and though she didn't say another word, she stepped forward. Some stories don't end with applause or headlines. They end quietly in moments no one else sees. 1 month later, Jasmine Crockett sat alone at her desk when one of those moments arrived, wrapped in a plain white envelope. It was late evening in her Capitol Hill office, the kind of late where even the janitors had gone home, and the only light came from a single desk lamp, casting soft gold across a pile of unresolved bills and unread memos. Jasmine sat unmoving, her back straight, eyes heavy from the day's political combat. But then, at the very top of her mail stack, she noticed something strange. An envelope, smaller than the rest, with her name handwritten in neat, hesitant strokes. There was no return address, just "To Ms. Crockett" in blue ink that looked like it had pause between each letter, as if unsure it belonged here. She opened it carefully as though the paper might tear more than its surface if rushed. Inside was a single photo, slightly curled at the edges. The image hit her like a slow-motion punch to the chest. It was the girl, standing in a barn lit by warm sunset, wearing a volunteer's vest 2 sizes too big, her name tag crooked but beaming. She was holding a water bowl, gently tilted toward a black and white dog lying on a hay bed beside her. Toby, now clearly gaining weight, his ears alert, eyes soft with the kind of trust that couldn't be faked. Behind them, wooden beams wrapped in string lights formed the shape of a heart. There was dirt on the girl's jeans, straw in her hair, but her smile was whole. Tucked behind the photo was a folded letter, handwritten in that same uncertain but determined hand. "Dear Ms. Crockett, I wasn't sure how to start this. I still don't. They say when someone saves your life, you never forget the sound of their voice. I don't remember all the words you said that night, but I remember how calm you were. Like even when I was breaking, you weren't. I didn't believe people like you stopped for people like me, but you did. You didn't walk by. You didn't tell me to call a number or go to a shelter. You sat down, you stayed, and because you stayed, I gotta stay alive. I feed rescue dogs now. I wash cages, I write down meds. I've memorized every dog's name here, and I tell Toby about each one before bed like stories. I still want to be a vet, but now I know I can be one. Not because I'm special, but because I was seen. Thank you for seeing me, for fighting for me like I mattered. I do now. Love." Jasmine didn't move for a long time. The office buzzed faintly with the sound of a distant hallway light and the slow tick of a clock that felt too loud in the silence. She stared at the letter like it was a mirror into a life she thought had already hardened beyond feeling. Then wordlessly, she folded the page with deliberate care, like she was closing something sacred, not shutting it away. She reached to her left, opened the drawer second from the bottom, the one she never let staff touch, and placed the letter inside. Next to the only photo she kept from her own childhood, a faded picture of her mother in scrubs, arms outstretched, standing in front of a South Dallas community clinic with a dog curled at her feet. It was the last time Jasmine saw her mother smile before cancer took her in the same hospital she once volunteered in. That photo had lived alone in the drawer for years. Now it had company. Jasmine closed the drawer softly, not like hiding a secret, but like planting something. And in the quiet hum of that late office night, she didn't cry. She didn't speak. She just sat still, staring at the space where the envelope had been. Because sometimes the most radical act isn't standing up in Congress. Sometimes it's choosing, in the middle of a storm, to kneel beside a child and say, "I see you," and knowing one day that child might rise. That drawer clicked shut like a seal on a chapter Jasmine hadn't realized she needed. But the silence that followed wasn't empty. It echoed with something heavier than grief, quieter than victory, a reckoning. Jasmine stayed seated in the half-light of her office, elbows on her knees, hands clasped loosely, as if in prayer. Not the kind with saints or scripture, but the kind you whisper when you've seen too much to pretend anymore. The letter sat beside her, its creases still sharp. The photo burned in her mind like an afterimage. A girl, a dog, a life reborn not through grand gestures, but through something far more fragile: attention. The silence pressed in, but Jasmine didn't flinch. She had lived in silences like this before. Courtroom silences before a verdict. Hallway silences after a funeral. The silence of a child waiting for someone to come back who never would. But this one was different. This silence wasn't the absence of noise. It was the presence of truth. She leaned back, eyes tracing the ceiling as if the words might be written there. Then slowly she spoke. Not to anyone in the room, but to the space, the stillness, the memory. In a world where everybody's rushing to win, to post, to matter louder than the next, sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop, she said quietly, her voice the rhythm of memory. Just stop and look and see someone. She stood and walked slowly to the window. Outside, DC glowed as it always did. Urgent, indifferent. The Capitol dome stood like a monument to ideals far removed from the streets, where children froze alone under broken streetlights. She pressed her palm against the cold glass. "I almost didn't," she murmured. "That night, I had a driver waiting, a dozen emails flashing red, a fundraiser to prepare for. And God knows I've walked by people before. People with signs, people with stories, people with eyes asking questions I didn't want to answer." Her reflection stared back at her, faint in the pain. Older now, sharper, but not harder, not tonight. "I used to think you needed a title to make change," she said. "Congresswoman, judge, director, as if justice only lived in marble rooms with microphones. But that night, it lived in the back of a diner booth, in the quiet cracking of a child's voice, in a decision to sit instead of walk away." Her breath fogged the window slightly, then cleared. "She didn't ask me for much, just space, a few minutes. And when I gave that, everything else unfolded, like the world had been holding its breath, waiting for someone to care long enough to exhale." Jasmine turned from the window, walked back to her desk, and touched the drawer again. Not to open it, just to anchor herself in the weight of what it now held. "She reminded me," she whispered, "of myself, or who I could have become if someone hadn't stopped for me when I was a kid with more anger than answers." There was a long pause as she sat back down, eyes unfocused now, drifting somewhere between past and present. "How many people," she asked, not aloud but not silently either, "have I walked past? How many lives were quietly asking for help? And I never looked twice." She closed her eyes and saw the girl again, hunched in the rain, arms wrapped around a soaked cardboard sign the night they met. She had looked like background, like tragedy too far gone to salvage, but she wasn't. She never was. "She was never invisible," Jasmine said, each word landing like a slow drumbeat. "We just trained ourselves not to see." She leaned back in her chair, exhaled deeply. Outside, a siren wailed and faded. The city kept moving. "How many moments like that do we miss?" she asked softly, voice lined with something between wonder and guilt. "All because we're 5 minutes late, or afraid of discomfort, Or convince someone else will stop instead? She looked around the office. The framed legislation, the awards, the flags, all the symbols of impact. And yet tonight, none of them felt as heavy as a handwritten letter from a girl no one thought would survive the month. In a world that measures success by how far you climb, she said, her voice trembling slightly, maybe we ought to start measuring it by how often we kneel beside someone who's fallen. The room grew still again. She folded her hands, this time not in thought, but in reverence, for the story that had landed in her lap, not by strategy, but by serendipity, for the kind of change that doesn't come with headlines or speeches, the kind that changes one life, one night, one dog, one girl, and maybe, if the world's watching closely enough, one nation's sense of what matters. The clock ticked once more, and with it, a final question rose. Not for applause, not for approval, but for anyone willing to hear it echo. How many people do we walk past each day and miss the chance to do the only thing that ever truly changes the world? To stop. Jasmine leaned back in her chair, exhaling a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding since that night. A single question echoed in her mind, relentless as a heartbeat. What if I hadn't stopped? Not out of guilt, but clarity. What if she had climbed into the black SUV, pulled out of that parking lot, and let that girl become someone else's burden or no one's? The truth was brutal in its simplicity. No one else had stopped. Not the donors in suits. Not the waitstaff who glanced and turned away. Not the passing strangers too caught up in their timelines and to-do lists. They all kept moving, cloaked in the same armor Jasmine herself once wore. Urgency, distraction, detachment. The armor of survival in a city too fast to feel. But what if one of them had stopped? What if any of them had seen the girl as more than a silhouette in the rain? The world might never know how close it came to losing her. And Jasmine, who had stood her ground in courts and committees, felt a deeper truth settle in her gut. A truth sharper than any political betrayal. We don't fail because we can't help. We fail because we don't stop to notice who needs help in the first place. It wasn't the first time she'd seen suffering. Jasmine grew up watching her mother work double shifts as a hospital janitor, wiping floors beneath beds of people who never bothered to say thank you. Her mother never asked for recognition, but she asked her daughter one thing every night before Jasmine fell asleep. Did you pay attention today? Not just to what you want, but to who's hurting? Jasmine used to think it was a lesson in kindness. Now she knew. It was a warning, because pain doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers. It walks quietly. It sits at the edge of sidewalks holding soaked cardboard signs. It answers, I'm fine, and when it's not. It dresses up as strength when it's really surrender. And if you're not looking, really looking, you'll miss it. Just like so many missed that girl. She remembered the girl's fingers wrapped around Toby's fur, as if letting go meant losing him forever. Remembered the way she sat at that diner, flinching at loud noises, scanning the room for exits like she'd had to memorize escape routes. That wasn't just trauma. That was survival. And Jasmine remembered what the girl said, almost too quietly to hear. I didn't think people like you stop for people like me. That sentence shattered her more than any courtroom defeat ever had. It made Jasmine question everything, her campaigns, her slogans, her speeches. She had always fought for justice, but maybe she had forgotten the smallest battlefield, the sidewalk. Maybe she had been so focused on systemic change that she'd forgotten personal intervention was its root. One girl, one dog, one decision. That was the lesson, and it didn't end at that diner, or the vet, or the photo in the envelope. It followed Jasmine into every room now. It whispered at every committee hearing. It pulsed behind every headline. Every time she heard a colleague refer to the homeless problem or kids in the system, she didn't hear statistics anymore. She saw her. She saw the night someone almost walked past the story that changed everything. The injustice, Jasmine realized, was never just the cruelty people inflicted. It was the ease with which others watched and moved on. The indifference, the polite avoidance, the ability to look suffering in the face and call it not my business. But it was her business. It was everyone's business. Because in a world this interconnected, there's no such thing as someone else's problem. There's only what we choose to notice and what we pretend not to. Jasmine's hands curled around the letter again. It smelled faintly of dog fur and lemon soap. She wondered how long the girl had stared at the blank page before finding the courage to write. She wondered what it took for someone who had been discarded to believe their words mattered. And she thought of Toby, the dog who refused to eat unless someone sat beside him, who waited at the door long after his people were gone, who bore his own kind of grief, silent and sacred. It made her wonder, how many Tobys were out there now? How many kids clutching leashes to memories, trying to protect what little they had left? More than she could count. More than anyone wanted to admit. But numbers didn't matter. Moments did. Jasmine stood up slowly, placing the photo and letter gently into the top drawer of her desk, next to the only other item she kept there. A faded photo of her mother, smiling in scrubs outside the hospital, holding a lunchbox in one hand and a stack of patient charts in the other. That woman taught her to listen, to slow down, to see. And tonight, Jasmine made herself a new promise. Not political, not performative, a personal one. Never walk past again. She walked to the window, cracked it open, and let the cold air bite. It reminded her of that night, the slick street, the trembling girl, the silence heavy with unsaid things. She thought about how close that story had come to ending differently. And then, for the first time in a long time, Jasmine Crockett cried. Not because she was sad, but because she finally understood the most terrifying truth of all. We are the answer to each other's pain. No law, no government, just us, stopping, asking, staying. And in that truth, sharp, inconvenient, and beautiful, Jasmine found her clearest mission yet, to fight not just for the unheard, but for the unseen. Because sometimes the greatest revolution is simply refusing to keep walking. She stands at the window with the city glittering beneath her, like a constellation of unfinished stories. And in the humming quiet, Jasmine Crockett feels the letter's weight convert into fuel, realizing that the line between ordinary routine and extraordinary rescue is only ever a heartbeat long, which means every person who hurries past suffering is choosing, consciously or not, to let a life unravel. So in this lingering breath, she resolves to turn memory into marching orders for anyone who will listen. We live in an age where convenience is a narcotic, where algorithms curate our compassion and headlines speed date our outrage, where a child can shiver on a curb outside a five-star restaurant while million-dollar cars glide by on silent electric engines, where a veteran panhandles beneath a 20-story ad for luxury condos, where a dog's cries echo behind a boarded garage as crates of fresh groceries roll past. And the true obscenity isn't poverty or pain, but the practiced indifference we polish into normalcy every single day. So hear this. The revolution begins not with podiums or polls, but with presence. Because stopping for one frightened girl and her dying dog carved a fault line through the inertia of an entire metropolis. Jasmine's simple question, "Are you okay?" became a battering ram against centuries of "not my problem," proving a brief pause can swing wider doors than any speech delivered to a room already convinced. Imagine right now the unseen theater of desperation unfolding beyond the glow of your phone. A runaway teen counting coins beneath a flickering lamppost. A trafficked child staring through a motel window at people who might be heroes if they only noticed. A battered woman rehearsing excuses while she hides bruises in a public restroom. An immigrant day laborer collapsing from heat beside the highway. A stray with ribs like xylophone bars chasing after a car that will never stop. Each scene waiting for a single witness bold enough to trespass against indifference. You do not need a badge, a budget line, or a blue-check profile to intervene. You need only the audacity to let compassion disrupt your schedule. Because every hierarchy that excuses apathy, class, race, politics, fatigue, crumbles the moment one person refuses to treat another human life as background scenery. And if Jasmine could leverage a rain-soaked moment into a lifetime of possibility for a stranger, then the rest of us have no defense for our silence. Think of the arithmetic of avoidance. Every time you ignore a trembling hand, the cost compounds. Emergency rooms overflow, shelters buckle, prisons swell, headlines harden, innocence curdles into violence. Democracy erodes one unseen citizen at a time until the bill comes due in blood, and we wonder how the nightmare started when the answer was stitched into the small choices we justified as too busy. So the mandate is disarmingly simple. Pause, look, ask, stay. Let your feet halt instead of hurry. Let your eyes meet the ones society teaches you to avoid. Let your voice become a bridge rather than a barrier. And if fear whispers, you'll be dragged into chaos. Remember that chaos is already here, stalking the ignored corners of every city, and the only antidote is deliberate, inconvenient kindness. Because when you stop, you ignite a chain reaction. The girl survives, the dog heals, the foster family discovers purpose, the nonprofit gains momentum, lawmakers glimpse humanity beyond statistics, a neighborhood witnesses redemption in real time, and somewhere down that line, another passerby decides they too will intervene, turning a single act into a widening current powerful enough to erode the bedrock of systemic neglect. Let this be your directive. Volunteer at the overcrowded clinic, mentor the kid nobody picks for teams, donate before disaster strikes, call out cruelty even when it ruins dinner conversation, vote like every box on the ballot hides a life in the margins, amplify stories that won't trend without you, build workplaces where people are valued more than profit, and above all, cultivate the reflex to stop and keep stopping until stopping is no longer radical but ordinary. So the next time the world blurs by in a rush of deadlines, earbuds, and glowing screens, remember the girl who found a future because one stranger refused to walk past. Ask yourself how many miracles are stranded on the shoulder of your daily commute, and choose to be the interruption, the inconvenient witness, the necessary pause, because history isn't written only by great speeches and towering laws, but by every quiet soul who decides, at whatever personal cost, that no life will disappear into the dark unchallenged on their watch. Resolve alone is a silent oath. Action is the roar that makes it real. Jasmine knows the roar must come from all of us, so hear this, and let it punch through your chest like a starter's pistol. Imagine a single downtown sidewalk at dawn, commuters speed walking past a boy, cradling a shivering dog beneath a flickering street lamp. In that instant, you decide comfort can wait. You crouch, you ask, you listen, and the world's axis shifts because you refuse to treat a living crisis as scenery. Cruelty's favorite weapon is convenience. We scroll tragedies, mute sirens, step over cardboard pleas, then excuse ourselves with busyness while injustice fattens on our hurry. Yet every overlooked life is a deferred catastrophe that will boomerang as crowded ERs, colder prisons, angrier streets. Revolutions are seeded by people who interrupt this cycle, who convert empathy into logistics, buying a meal, calling a clinic, rallying strangers in a waiting room, hammering city council inboxes until policy budgets human worth. Do not underestimate the contagion of one pause. A nurse waives an intake fee after you speak up. A bystander volunteers to drive. A reporter live streams the moment. Donations flood. A counselor drafts a no-kill ordinance. And suddenly the sidewalk where you stopped becomes the epicenter of a widening moral quake. Expect ridicule, bleeding heart, virtue signaler, soft. But remember, cynicism is the anthem of comfortable bystanders, and your defiance is proof their anthem is dying. Carry the memory of a dog's fading pulse and a girl's shaking voice as armor against their derision. Translate outrage into habit. Schedule a monthly clinic shift. Budget a standing donation. Keep care kits in your trunk. Practice eye contact with the invisible. Teach your children that mind your business is sometimes the cruelest phrase in English. If you command resources, weaponize them. Fund scholarships that tether foster kids to futures. Underwrite mobile vet vans. Push companies to audit pay gaps. Remind legislators that budgets are moral manifestos. If you hold only stamina and sincerity, wield them like a crowbar, pry open conversations, break the locks of apathy, sit beside pain until it trusts relief. A sandwich offered with dignity can reroute a stranger's trajectory more decisively than 1,000 retweets. Let discomfort be your compass, compassion your fuel, imagination your map. Envision cities where bus stop ads match volunteers to real-time needs, where zoning laws bake kindness into blueprints, where school graduations require a year of service so that knowledge and empathy graduate together. You are the hinge between indifference and intervention, the thin red thread keeping another life from unraveling. And history will not remember how many errands you ran on schedule. It will echo with the names that breathed easier, because you were late for something unimportant, but right on time to change everything. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. Inside the U.S. Capitol, in a live hearing watched by 12 million Americans, Kristi Noem pushes a shocking plan. Send undocumented immigrants, including children, to Guantanamo Bay, calling it the only way to protect America. Jasmine Crockett rises from her seat, seemingly outmatched, until she drops evidence so undeniable it turns the entire hearing into a national reckoning. One woman defends power, the other defends humanity. And in a room built to silence dissent, only one voice shatters everything. When the truth finally hits, will America stand up or look away again? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Inside the marble-clad hearing chamber of the United States Capitol, the air felt heavier than usual, thick with the static of tension and televised expectation. Cameras from every major network were positioned at sharp angles, their red lights blinking like bloodshot eyes waiting to catch a fall. The chamber was packed wall to wall, political aides, press corps, restless citizens, and behind the mahogany panel sat the two women who had come to define opposite poles of America's soul. On one side sat Kristi Noem, the Secretary of Homeland Security, known for her ice-cold rhetoric, unyielding border policies, and recent defense of transferring undocumented immigrants to Guantanamo Bay. A plan some legal scholars had already called constitutional treason. Her pearl earrings gleamed under the spotlight as she sat upright, composed, and ready to strike. On the other side stood Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, the unapologetic firebrand from Texas, whose rise had been built not on cautious diplomacy, but on truth told at full volume, and sometimes at personal cost. She adjusted her blazer slowly, not in vanity, but as armor, aware she was walking into a storm that had already been rigged against her. As the gavel dropped, the chair declared the hearing open, and every heartbeat in the room synced to one silent question. When justice speaks against power, will it even be allowed to finish its sentence? And just as the silence turned razor sharp, Kristi Noem adjusted the microphone with the steady hand of someone who had delivered countless political executions without ever raising her voice. Her expression was unreadable, somewhere between courtroom composure and battlefield resolve. And when she finally spoke, it wasn't to persuade, it was to dominate. "Let me be absolutely clear," she began, pausing just long enough for the cameras to lock in. "Undocumented immigrants are not victims. They are threats." Her tone didn't tremble. It didn't rise. It simply sliced through the oxygen in the room like a blade. Deliberate, surgical, cruel. "We are not talking about families," she continued, her eyes sweeping the room like floodlights in a prison yard. "We are talking about breaches, in our laws, in our security, in our sovereignty." The weight of her language was designed not just to criminalize, but to dehumanize. And then came the line that turned stomachs and straightened spines. "Guantanamo Bay is not a punishment. It's a necessity. It's the only place left where we can ensure these people are held without risk to the American way of life." Around her, aides nodded like pre-programmed machines. Behind her, a row of Republican lawmakers stiffened into postures of agreement. The word necessity still hung in the air like the aftertaste of metal. She leaned back slightly, satisfied, and delivered her final thrust. "We have coddled illegal entry long enough. This is no longer a border issue. This is a national survival issue, and I, for one, refuse to apologize for defending my country." Her voice never rose, but her message roared through the chamber like a siren. In Kristi Noem's America, mercy was weakness, law was weaponized, and those who didn't belong would be caged, far, far away from the flag they had dared to walk toward. The frost of Kristi Noem's final declaration still clung to the walls when she leaned forward once more, as if what she was about to say had been waiting, sharpened, just beneath her tongue. Her voice dropped half a register, calm, calculated, and lethal in its precision. "For those who insist on portraying these individuals as victims of some broken system," she said, enunciating each word as if reading an indictment, "I'll remind this chamber of the case brought by 10 undocumented immigrants last year." Her eyes swept across the room with icy indifference, not to persuade, but to dominate, her gaze bypassing Jasmine Crockett entirely, as if her presence was beneath engagement. "They claimed we violated their rights by detaining them without due process. They said being relocated to military custody was unconstitutional." She paused, not for effect, but as if even acknowledging the case required more generosity than she believed they deserved. "It went to federal court," she continued, her tone flattening into something even colder, "and the case was dismissed, without prejudice, without merit." She sat back slightly, her shoulders squared, lips tight with the grim satisfaction of someone who had just recited a eulogy and didn't plan on mourning. And then, in a voice so stripped of empathy it chilled the room more than if she'd shouted, she uttered the words that would ricochet beyond the chamber walls. "They lost. Suck it." The silence that followed was not shock. It was recoil, a kind of spiritual flinch, not just at the obscenity itself, but at the casual violence behind it. It wasn't just a comment, it was a message. To every migrant watching, to every advocate in the room, and to every lawmaker who still believed justice required compassion. Your pain is irrelevant, your voice is noise, and your loss is entertainment. The sting of "suck it" still hung in the chamber, like a venomous fog when Jasmine Crockett rose from her seat. There was no theatrics in her movement, only precision, resolve, and the weight of everything she was about to say. Her fingertips brushed the edge of her notes, but her eyes remained fixed on the dais, steady and unflinching. She wasn't just standing as a congresswoman, she was standing as the daughter of a nurse who'd been denied front-door access to the hospital she served for over 4 decades. She was standing as a lawyer who'd seen too many lives swallowed by a system that called itself lawful but operated on cruelty. And just as she drew breath to speak, to lay down her first line of legal rebuttal, the interruption came like a gunshot across the floor. "Congresswoman Crockett," Kristi Noem barked, her voice louder, sharper, and filled with a kind of venom that didn't need to shout to wound. "If you're more concerned about the lives of criminal trespassers than the security of this nation's children, then maybe you're sitting in the wrong damn room." She didn't just cut Jasmine off. She tried to erase her. The words weren't just a challenge to her argument. They were an attack on her right to exist in that space, to speak with authority, to belong. Gasps fluttered through the gallery like birds startled from a wire, and for one brutal moment, time seemed to bend. Not because of what was said, but because of who it was said to, in the centuries it echoed. Noem didn't look away. She stared straight at Crockett, cold and triumphant, as if daring her to prove she deserved the mic still resting in front of her. And Crockett, still standing, still silent, bore it all. The slight, the venom, the national stage, with a calm that wasn't weakness, but the beginning of a storm. The chamber had already gone quiet in the wake of Noem's cold interruption, but what followed wasn't silence. It was suffocation. Every pair of eyes was locked on Jasmine Crockett, waiting for her to speak, to respond, to assert her place in the room. But before she could even draw her next breath, Kristi Noem leaned into the microphone again, this time slower, closer, with the calm of someone who didn't raise her voice because she knew the system already echoed it for her. Her lips curled into the faintest trace of a smile. Not joy, but certainty. Her tone dropped half an octave, her voice soft enough to seem measured, but soaked in the kind of malice that only those who've never feared exclusion can wield without hesitation. You know, she said, dragging the words out like a scalpel tracing bone, if you can't see anything worth defending in this country, maybe it's because you never really belonged to it in the first place. There was no confusion in her delivery, only the cold precision of a woman who knew exactly what she was doing. She paused, letting the implication rot in the air, then delivered the next blow, not loudly, not angrily, but with a poison more dangerous than either. Maybe you should go back to Africa. There was no gasp, there was no shout. There was something worse, a stillness so absolute it felt like time had stalled. Aides froze mid-typing. The press gallery fell completely still. The chairperson didn't interrupt. No one did. And in that quiet, the weight of her words crashed down not just on Jasmine Crockett, but on every person in the room who had ever been told they were American in law, but foreign in spirit. Noam didn't stop there. Her eyes scanned the room like a general claiming territory. America, she said, each syllable clipped and cruel, belongs to us, to those who love it, who protect it, not to people who show up to tear it down from within. The words were heavy not because they were original, but because they were ancient. A recycled toxin, dressed in modern language, spoken from behind a government microphone under the seal of the United States. It wasn't a policy dispute. It wasn't even coded language. It was a bare-knuckled declaration of ownership, of the country, of the chamber, of the narrative, and Jasmine Crockett had just been told she didn't fit into any of it. In that moment, Noam wasn't speaking about immigration. She wasn't speaking about Guantanamo. She was speaking about who gets to belong. And by doing so, she wasn't just attempting to erase Jasmine's voice. She was trying to erase her existence from the American story, live, on national television. And the nation was watching. The silence after Kristi Noem's final words was not just quiet, it was surgical. It split the air with the precision of something unspeakable, finally said out loud. Jasmine Crockett remained still, her spine straight, eyes forward, as the echo of "Go Back to Africa" rang without a microphone. She didn't flinch, didn't reach for her notes, didn't cast a glance toward her aides. The room around her felt distant, the whispers of reporters now static, the stiffening of lawmakers like shadows retreating under pressure. She stood in it, in all of it. The insult, the weight, the legacy of being publicly told that her blackness disqualified her Americanness. And then, with a grace that wasn't soft but forged, she stepped forward toward the microphone, her heels striking against the floor like punctuation in a courtroom no one could adjourn. Every eye followed her, some wide in disbelief, others narrowed with anticipation. But Jasmine didn't perform for any of them. She had something to say that didn't need applause. When she reached the mic, her hands remained still at her sides, her shoulders squared. Her voice didn't rise, didn't shake, didn't falter. It dropped, heavy, precise, and deliberate. I was born in Dallas, Texas, she said, not as a rebuttal, but as a reclaiming. My mother was a nurse for 43 years. 43. And in all that time, she never once entered the front door of the hospital where she healed people. Not because she wasn't qualified, not because she wasn't needed, but because the color of her skin told them she didn't deserve to be seen. Her eyes locked on Noam like a vice, not with fury, but with a clarity that burned colder than rage. So let me correct your history, she continued, her tone now sharpened into steel. I don't need to go anywhere. I didn't come here from somewhere else. I was born in this country. My roots are in this soil. My blood helped build this chamber. And I stand here today not to defend myself, but to defend the idea that this country still belongs to the people who bleed for it, not just the people who hoard it. The silence didn't break. It shattered. Her final sentence hadn't yet cooled in the air when Jasmine Crockett shifted her weight ever so slightly. Not out of hesitation, but to root herself more firmly into the floor beneath her. The weight of the moment wasn't lost on her. It pressed in from every wall of the chamber, from every camera, every breathless viewer at home, and from the centuries of voices that had been silenced before they ever reached a podium like this. And yet, she didn't flinch. Instead, in one slow, deliberate motion, the kind that reclaims space without asking permission. She lifted her hand and pointed it directly at Kristi Noem, not with aggression, not with drama, but with the kind of clarity that strips away pretense and reveals exactly where the rod is sitting. The room responded not with gasps, but with stillness, a stunned, reverent stillness, as though everyone present understood, instinctively, that something irreversible had just begun. Jasmine's hand didn't waver. Her finger cut through the charged silence like a scalpel through scar tissue, drawing no blood but exposing everything beneath. It wasn't just a gesture of defiance. It was an indictment, not shouted, but carved into the record of the room. Her voice, when it came, didn't need to rise. It carried with the force of truth that had waited too long to be spoken aloud. "If you think skin color determines who gets to be called us," she said, her tone icy and exact, "then maybe you are the one who doesn't belong in this room." There was no stutter in her delivery, no pause to savor the moment, because this wasn't a performance. It was a recalibration of authority, of legitimacy, of the invisible lines that had been drawn and redrawn throughout history to exclude people who looked like her. The phrase "doesn't belong" echoed through the chamber like the toll of a slow, heavy bell. And it didn't just refer to Noam's seat at the table. It questioned her moral fitness to occupy any position of power that claimed to represent the people of the United States. The words didn't explode. They sank. They pressed down into the polished wood of the hearing table, into the marble columns, into the bones of the building itself, and into the bones of every person listening who had ever been told they were other in a country they had helped build. It wasn't anger. It was judgment. And that's what made it so devastating. Jasmine hadn't just called Noam out. She had called her in, forced her to stand in the full light of her own rhetoric, stripped of the usual political camouflage. The silence that followed was not the silence of awkwardness. It was the silence of a room recalibrating its gravity. Jasmine's words had shifted the center of power. In one sentence, she had moved the moral authority of the room from the title printed on a nameplate to the truth etched into lived experience. For the first time all morning, Kristi Noem didn't have a response. She didn't reach for her notes. She didn't look to her aides. She didn't even blink. Because something deeper than shame had landed. Something that didn't just bruise but exposed. She sat frozen, her carefully constructed poise now brittle under the weight of what she could not dismiss. Because the moment Jasmine pointed, not just her finger, but the truth, something shifted. The room was no longer operating under Noam's terms. It no longer belonged to the one who had spoken with cruelty and called it patriotism. It now belonged to the woman she had tried to discredit, tried to diminish, tried to exile, and who had just answered with the quiet force of belonging no insult could undo. The silence following Jasmine Crockett's indictment of belonging had not yet lifted when she shifted her weight and reached, with the same steady hand that had moments earlier pointed toward Kristi Noem, for a worn manila folder resting beside her notes. The room was still reeling from the moral shockwave, but now it braced for something different. Evidence. Tangible. Unequivocal. She didn't rush. She opened the folder with the kind of careful finality that made it clear this wasn't a political prop. It was a ledger of truth the nation could no longer afford to ignore. She held up a single page, the official seal of the Department of Defense stamped at the top in embossed black, glinting faintly under the overhead lights like the eye of a witness too long silent. She spoke without haste, but each word landed with the weight of institutional authority. According to this internal Department of Defense security audit, there exists no threat designation, no behavioral risk profile, and no criminal indicator associated with the migrants who were pre-selected for relocation to Guantanamo Bay. A few heads turned sharply, not toward her, but toward each other. She let the statement linger. The silence wasn't for effect. It was for digestion. Then she laid the first page down and drew out another, thicker report. The cover titled plainly, Joint Intelligence Task Force on Migrant Security Risk Assessment, Summary Review, Classified Appendix Excluded. She tapped her finger once on the margin as if to underline the absurdity of what was coming. This is a summary of a full-spectrum cross-agency risk review. It concludes, in language that could not be clearer, that none of the individuals in question presented even a moderate risk classification. Not one had ties to known criminal networks. Not one was flagged by biometric security systems. And not one had a record of violent conduct in any country, let alone on U.S. soil. Her eyes rose from the page and locked with the committee. The expression on her face was not triumphant. It was sober, unforgiving. She wasn't defending a point. She was unveiling a breach. These people were not criminals. They were not insurgents. They were not threats to national security, but they were treated as if they were, labeled without cause, seized without charges, routed into a system that strips away names and replaces them with numbers, as if dignity is a privilege, not a right. She lifted a third document, this one marked with the letterhead of the U.S. State Department's Office of Legal Advisor. It was stamped confidential, but declassified for hearing use. She spoke again, voice low but piercing. And here, from the very office that drafts our foreign policy and ensures our treaty compliance, a legal finding. The extrajudicial detention of civilians, especially those seeking asylum, without formal charges or access to legal counsel, violates multiple provisions of the Geneva Conventions, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and the Convention Against Torture. She let the gravity settle like a curtain dropping. Her voice did not tremble. It sharpened. We are not protecting our Constitution with these actions. We are violating it. We are not reinforcing our international standing. We are eroding it. What has been proposed, what has been authorized, is not policy. It is a blueprint for state-sponsored erasure. Then folding the final page with calm deliberation, she looked straight ahead, not at Kristi Noem, but at the eyes of every legislator in the room, every aide taking notes, every camera capturing history in real time. This is not about border control. This is about fear masquerading as authority. This is about cruelty packaged as patriotism. And if we allow the machinery of due process to be bypassed because the bodies caught in it are poor, brown, and displaced, then we are not just failing the Constitution, we are betraying it. There was no applause, no objection, only silence, the kind that doesn't mark the end of a speech, but the beginning of accountability. She stood motionless for a heartbeat longer, the weight of truth pressing into the air like a storm front descending. The final page of the report rested beneath her fingertips, now closed but seething with everything it had exposed. Evidence, not opinion. Legality, not noise. The room was taut, every gaze fixed, every breath halting, as if no one wanted to interrupt the gravity that had settled in the wake of her unflinching clarity. Jasmine Crockett leaned forward slowly, not as a gesture of aggression, but with the deliberate presence of someone who had earned the right to speak with finality. Her voice returned, low and precise, more powerful for its calm. It wasn't angry. It was inevitable. A verdict, not a plea. Let's be clear, she said, eyes narrowing ever so slightly. There is no one crossing that border with more intent to damage this country than you, Secretary Noem. The silence was immediate, heavy. She let it stretch just long enough to become inescapable. Those people, she continued, her voice deepening into steel, they are not storming our gates to destroy. They are crawling to them, with children in their arms, with wounds still bleeding, with hope as their last piece of luggage, because they are running from death. Her tone didn't break, but the room felt it. The tremor not in her voice, but in the uncomfortable stillness that followed. The kind that forces people to listen when they wish they could look away. And you, and with all your power, all your access, all your armored words, you take that desperation and turn it into a weapon. She straightened just slightly, her next sentence spoken with the sharpness of a scalpel tracing the truth. You are not defending the nation. You are decorating cruelty in the colors of the flag. A pause, one final breath, then the final line. Not shouted, but carved into the floor between them like scripture etched in stone. You make death legal and call it patriotism. The sentence didn't echo. It landed, heavy, final, unarguable. And when it did, the entire hearing chamber fell under its weight, because what had just been said could not be unsaid. Jasmine Crockett hadn't just challenged Kristi Noem's policy. She had stripped it down to its marrow and forced everyone watching to see what lay beneath the language, the laws, the flags, the applause, sanctioned suffering disguised as safety. And she had done it without raising her voice, because the truth, when delivered with enough precision, is louder than any shout. The heat from Crockett's final statement still lingered in the room like smoke from a controlled detonation, clean, devastating, and impossible to ignore when Kristi Noem's composure finally cracked. Her hands clenched visibly on the tabletop, her shoulders squared not with control, but with rising indignation she could no longer disguise. The performative calm she had mastered through years of press briefings and campaign stops evaporated in a single moment of fury that felt personal, primal. She leaned forward, her voice sharp and rising, slicing through the stillness like shattered glass. "If I have to choose," she barked, "between some child from Mexico and my child, I will choose my child every single time." Her words didn't just pierce the room. They attempted to divide it. Her tone wasn't defensive, it was defiant. A last-ditch effort to reframe the narrative, not around law or justice, but around tribal survival. Us versus them, mine versus theirs. The tension in the chamber contracted again, not from surprise but from recognition, because everyone knew this argument. It was the oldest one in the book of cruelty. The illusion of moral clarity built on the backs of the powerless. Noem hadn't spoken to defend a policy. She had spoken to justify hierarchy. She invoked motherhood not to protect life, but to diminish it, to suggest that some children mattered more simply because of where they were born, or more precisely where they weren't. And Jasmine Crockett knew it. She didn't blink, didn't turn away. Instead, she leaned in too, not with volume, not with anger, but with a cold precision that cut through Noem's outburst like wire through fog. Her voice dropped half a register, not to soften the blow, but to make sure each syllable landed exactly where it needed to. "No one asked you to choose between two children," she said, her words steady, sharpened by restraint. "No one forced that question but you." She paused just long enough for the accusation to land, then continued, each sentence more surgical than the last. "What you are doing is deciding which child gets to be called a child, and which one gets to be labeled a threat." Her eyes didn't move from Noem's. Her voice didn't rise. And that's what made it devastating. "You're not defending your child. You're defending the idea that only children like yours deserve protection, that only children like yours get innocence, that only children like yours are worth saving." The room didn't stir. It couldn't, because Crockett had done something that doesn't happen often in spaces like this. She had stripped away the armor of self-righteous fear and laid bare the moral bankruptcy beneath. Her words weren't a rebuttal. They were a mirror. And for the first time that day, it was Noem who couldn't look directly into it. The moment hung suspended in the air, Crockett's voice still echoing in the moral stillness she had carved into the room. When she turned slightly, never breaking eye contact with the panel, and spoke two words that felt like a final commandment. "Roll it." The technician, seated off to the side of the hearing chamber, didn't hesitate. A faint click echoed as the screen behind the witnesses lit up in stark white, then dimmed into color, and then into memory. A memory the nation had tried to scroll past but couldn't. The video began with a wide studio shot, clean lighting, curated backdrop, a host nodding politely across from Kristi Noem, who sat back in her chair like someone used to being told she was right. The segment was clipped at the exact moment that mattered. The host asked about the recent legal challenge brought by undocumented immigrants claiming constitutional violations after being relocated to Guantanamo Bay. Noem shrugged, not apologetically, defiantly. Her voice was almost flippant. "They lost," she said, and then, with a smile so slight it chilled the skin more than any smirk, she added, "Suck it." The words echoed out across the chamber again, but this time they didn't feel like a soundbite. They felt like a slap. Replayed not in a studio but in a courtroom. Replayed not on cable news but beneath the dome of the United States Capitol. The silence was immediate and brutal. Noam didn't flinch, but she didn't blink either. Because this time everyone was watching, and there was no laugh track, no commercial break, no Fox News host to pivot the outrage. The screen faded to black for a second, not long enough for anyone to recover, and then lit back up. But the tone was different. The second video was grainier, handheld, intimate. The timestamp in the corner confirmed it had been recorded less than 2 months ago, a refugee camp somewhere in southern Texas. Inside a canvas tent, lit by a single hanging bulb, a woman sat cross-legged on the ground, her clothes damp from the rain that leaked through the seams. In her hands was a photograph, bent, weather-worn, its edges frayed. She didn't look at the camera. She didn't need to. Her voice when it came was soft, hollow, translated in subtitles below. "They told me I lost my son." She looked down at the photo, a boy no older than 7, smiling with 2 missing teeth. Her voice cracked. "They said he was gone, taken, and then—" She swallowed hard. Her lips trembled, but she forced the words out anyway. Not in her native Spanish, but in the English she had learned by necessity, not by choice. "They looked at me and said, 'Suck it.'" The screen went black. No music, no narration, no credits. Just silence so heavy it felt like it had mass. And in that silence, the entire hearing room, representatives, aides, staffers, press, sat motionless, trapped in the void between what had just been shown and what could never again be unseen. Noam didn't speak, couldn't, because in that moment, her words had escaped the safety of spin and become what they truly were, a weapon. And Crockett, without raising her voice, had done what no debate ever could. She had shown America exactly where the line had been crossed, and exactly who had stepped over it. The black screen lingered like a wound left open. The image of the mother's trembling voice and hollow eyes burned into the room's collective consciousness. No one spoke. Not a page turned, not a breath dared break the weight in the air. Jasmine Crockett stood at the center of it. Not triumphant, not vindicated, but resolute, her silence heavier than any closing statement. And then, slowly, she turned. Not to the committee, not to Kristi Noem, not even to the rows of press hunched behind glowing laptops. She turned directly toward the primary broadcast camera, the one streaming into homes, classrooms, living rooms, hospital waiting areas, and bus stations across the country. Her face came into full frame, not with rage, but with a solemnity so grounded it felt like the entire chamber had shifted to make space for what she was about to say. Her gaze didn't waver. Her expression didn't shift. She looked into the lens as if it were a witness under oath. "That," she said, her voice low, steady, and unmistakably final, "is the language that left the mouth of a government official of the United States of America." The room tensed, not because the words were new, but because this time they were irrevocable. No excuses, no spin, no euphemism, just raw, state-issued contempt. Jasmine let the silence stretch, then stepped closer to the microphone, closer to the moment. And that language, those 2 words, will outlive the press conference. They'll outlive the policy. They'll outlive every talking point meant to soften the blow. She took another step forward, not physically but morally, because while the official who said them will forget, while this chamber will move on to the next bill, the child who heard them through the bars of a detention center will carry them into adulthood. The mother who heard them after losing her son will carry them into grief. And both of them will carry that pain long after the rest of us have stopped watching. Her voice tightened, not with tears, but with clarity. A clarity that burned hot and bright. That was not just a soundbite, that was a sentence, handed down not in a courtroom, but in a hallway of power. And it was delivered with the full force of a government badge behind it. She drew one final breath, controlled, heavy, and gave the room and the country no room to look away. That wasn't policy, it was cruelty, televised and sanctioned. And now it's part of the record, not just of this hearing, but of who we are and who we've let ourselves become. And then she stepped back from the mic, not finished, but done, because there was nothing left to say. The truth had arrived, and it hadn't knocked. It had broken the door down. As Jasmine Crockett stepped back from the microphone, the air in the hearing room didn't return to normal. It thickened, as if the oxygen itself had absorbed too much truth to circulate freely again. The silence that followed wasn't the pause after a powerful speech. It was something colder, something weightier. The kind of silence that settles after a verdict has been rendered, when all the masks have been peeled away and there's nothing left to say that won't sound like retreat. The room did not erupt. It did not respond with outrage or applause. It simply sat, frozen in the wake of a reckoning too precise to escape and too moral to ignore. Across the panel, a few members of Congress lowered their eyes, no longer able to maintain the artificial posture of neutrality. They weren't reacting as politicians now. They were reacting as people, stripped of party lines and talking points. One congressman, rigid all morning with partisanship, slowly folded his hands in front of his mouth and stared at the desk, as if the wood might offer absolution. Another, a woman known for towing the middle line, swallowed hard and looked away, her shoulders sagging under a realization she hadn't expected to confront on live television. It was no longer about left or right. It was about what had just been exposed and whether they had the courage to carry it. To the left side of the public seating area, a woman sat wrapped in a faded woven shawl, her dark braid tucked behind one ear, her eyes rimmed with quiet fire. She was Lakota, a legal advocate from Pine Ridge, invited as an observer to testify later that afternoon on native border displacement. But that moment would never come. She wouldn't need to speak today. Everything that needed to be said had already been delivered with such clarity, such moral force, that her testimony now felt like footnotes to a story already carved in stone. Her hands clasped tightly in her lap as she watched Crockett. Not with awe, but with shared grief. A silent understanding passed through her, the way only those who've survived systemic erasure can understand each other without words. A tear broke loose, then another, and she wiped them away not with embarrassment, but with quiet dignity. For once, someone had said the thing, not hinted, not softened, said it fully, and now the whole room had to live with it. Kristi Noem didn't move at first. She sat perfectly still, her face pale, drained of the righteous flush she had carried so confidently when the hearing began. Her hands, once perched in performative stillness atop her prepared remarks, had curled into anxious fists in her lap. She stared forward, unmoving, but not out of defiance. Something in her expression had changed. Not contrition, not recognition, something else. A crack, a flicker of dread that she might no longer be in control of what came next. Her lips parted slightly as if to speak, perhaps to defend, to redirect, to reclaim the floor. But nothing came. There was no comeback for what had just been said. No memo, no slogan. No speechwriter could spin what millions had just witnessed. For a moment longer, she remained frozen. Then slowly, stiffly, she pushed back her chair. The sound, legs dragging across marble, broke the stillness like a blade through silk. Heads turned, eyes tracked her, but she didn't look at anyone. Not at the panel, not at Crockett, not at the press. She didn't say a word. No apology, no rebuttal, no goodbye. She simply stood, collected her papers without purpose, and walked out of the chamber. Her heels echoed with each step, not like victory, not like authority, but like a retreat cloaked in pride. The doors, once flung open with fanfare upon her arrival, now closed behind her with a heavy finality. She did not glance back. For a long moment, no one moved. It was as if the room itself needed time to process what had occurred. The witness table stood empty. The chair she had once occupied remained slightly off-center, facing no one now. On the screen above, frozen in a digital still, was the image of a Honduran mother holding the photograph of her vanished child. Eyes fixed outward, unspeaking, but louder than any headline. Jasmine Crockett remained where she stood, not basking in triumph, but holding the weight of everything that had just transpired with the steadiness of someone who knew that speaking truth in rooms like this often comes at a cost. Her silence now wasn't hesitation. It was reverence. Reverence for the woman on the screen, for the mothers who never made it past the fences, for the children still waiting in cages, for the democracy still deciding whether it had a conscience. And outside in the cold breath of Washington, D.C., where cameras flashed and commentators waited for spin, the reckoning had already begun. Not in the headlines, but in the eyes of those who had watched the hearing and could no longer pretend they hadn't seen. By the time the heavy doors of the hearing room closed behind Kristi Noem, the tremors of what had unfolded inside were already rumbling through the country, not just across social media, but deep into the veins of power, journalism, and law. That evening, before the sun had fully set over Washington, front pages across the nation began to rewrite the political landscape in real time. The New York Times, usually restrained in tone, went blunt. Brought to her knees by one question, the Washington Post followed with, "Truth unedited, the moment that shook Capitol Hill." On cable news, anchors who had never once mentioned Jasmine Crockett by name now led with her face, her words, her stance, clips of the moment. If you think skin color determines who gets to be called us, aired back to back with the footage of Kristi Noem leaving the chamber in silence. It wasn't just a story, it was a collapse, a rupture, a breaking of the myth that cruelty, if spoken calmly enough, could be mistaken for leadership. Inside the Department of Homeland Security, aides scrambled to prepare a statement that could recast Noem's walkout as a strategic, but nothing landed. No phrasing could erase the sound of "suck it," echoed against the image of a mother mourning a child she'd never see again. Leaked emails from mid-level staffers surfaced the next morning, describing the atmosphere as untenable, morally radioactive, and off the rails. One particularly damning message read simply, "We told her not to go there. She went anyway. She burned it all down." And burn it she had, not in fire, but in light. The kind of light that exposes rather than destroys, the kind that no amount of spin can escape. Meanwhile, at the Capitol, the reverberations hit policy. By noon the next day, the proposed legislative framework that would have codified Guantanamo Bay as a migrant detention zone was formally pulled from the House agenda. No vote, no debate, not even a statement of postponement. It was scrubbed, quietly, hastily, as if it had never been there. The move was confirmed in a one-line press release issued by the Speaker's office. The committee has opted to explore alternative approaches to immigration enforcement. It was bureaucracy's way of folding without admitting defeat. But everyone knew the truth. The bill wasn't withdrawn because of political negotiation. It was withdrawn because it had become political poison. Inside Senate offices, staffers whispered what no one yet dared say into a microphone. Crockett had killed the bill with a sentence, not a filibuster, not a procedural trick. A single line spoken without shouting, pointed without embellishment. And it had been enough to expose the rotted core of a policy dressed in patriotism. Behind closed doors, one lawmaker, previously a quiet supporter of the bill, was overheard saying, "You can't put that clip next to your name and survive the next election." And in an election year, survival was the only currency that mattered. Meanwhile, Crockett herself avoided the press in the hours following the hearing. She didn't hold a victory speech. She didn't tour cable studios. When asked by reporters for a comment on Noem's walkout or the bill's demise, she responded with just 3 words, "Let the record speak." And it did. The record spoke louder than any press secretary, any pundit, any party whip. It spoke through the still frame of her pointing finger, through the tear-streaked face of the Honduran mother, through the silence of a room full of lawmakers who had run out of excuses, through the footsteps of a secretary who walked into the chamber wielding authority and left it unable to speak. Across campuses and community centers, the hearing became mandatory viewing. Law students replayed it in constitutional ethics lectures. Human rights clinics dissected it like a case study. It was no longer just about immigration. It was about what America had allowed itself to become when no one was watching, and what it still might become when someone finally refused to look away. Commentary pieces from both the left and right acknowledged the same thing. The moment had punctured something deeper than policy. It had called into question the conscience of a country built on the promise of equality, yet so often willing to trade justice for fear. And in that moment, with one sentence, one clip, one name rising out of the smoke, the law had not changed, but the ground beneath it had. Because now every attempt to revive that bill would carry a ghost. Not the ghost of an idea, but of a moment, when someone finally stood up, pointed through the noise, and called cruelty by its true name. And that moment, once televised, could never be undone. As the legislation vanished from the House floor and the headlines solidified her moral victory, the nation turned to its screens and found a new symbol staring back. She didn't walk into the studio like a politician. She walked in like someone who had nothing to sell, nothing to perform, and nothing left to prove. The lights were hot, the set sterile, but Jasmine Crockett sat beneath them as if they didn't exist. No stylists, no rehearsed pre-interview lines, no nervous laughter to pad the silence. She wore a simple black blazer, no pin, no slogan, no flag, just the clarity of someone who had already said everything that mattered when it mattered most. The anchor, a veteran of decades in primetime news, began not with a question, but with a quote that had already gone viral. If skin color determines who gets to be called us, then maybe you're the one who doesn't belong in this room. The words hung in the air like prophecy, not memory. Then the camera cut to Crockett. She didn't blink. She didn't smile. She simply nodded once and said, "Yes, I meant every word." From that moment, she stopped being Representative Jasmine Crockett and became something else entirely. Across screens and social media, her face, poised, unflinching, was given a name she hadn't asked for, but couldn't shake: the thunder in a season of lies. The phrase originated from an op-ed in The Atlantic, written by a professor of political rhetoric, who described her as the voice that didn't rise, but struck. The metaphor took hold like lightning to dry grass. Cable panels echoed it. Editorials adopted it. Protest signs began carrying it, handwritten in ink. "Thunder doesn't ask for permission," one placard read. "It just arrives." And Crockett had arrived, not with anger, but with authority no title could give, and no insult could take away. What gripped the nation wasn't just what she said, it was how she stood there, unmoved, as the full weight of a government figure's racial attack tried to unmake her in real time, and failed. It was her refusal to match vitriol with volume, her insistence on wielding silence like a blade, facts like fire. She didn't shout, she didn't flinch, she held. And in holding, she exposed something far more terrifying to the machinery of power than outrage. She exposed control. The kind of control that says, "You will not rewrite this moment. I won't let you." The networks leaned in, but none could frame her the way they usually frame politicians. She didn't fit the mold. She didn't ask for redemption. She wasn't apologizing, clarifying, or recalibrating. She was, as one host put it with barely concealed awe, a stillness that shattered everything. And that made her dangerous. Not to the public, not to the people watching, but to the people who had counted on business as usual, counted on cruelty to remain background noise, on conscience to stay off camera. They hadn't expected someone to stop the machine mid-sentence and hold a mirror up to its face. In interviews, Crockett was exact, not evasive. When asked if she believed Kristi Noem should resign, she didn't pivot. "I believe the country saw who she is," she said, "and I believe now the question isn't what she does next. It's what we do next." Every answer was like that, not for headlines, but for history. No spin, no choreography, just a kind of relentless moral clarity that reminded viewers what politics was supposed to sound like before it became theater. Outside the studio, something else was shifting. Voter registration spiked in communities where turnout had historically been low. Civic organizations began circulating her speech in classrooms. Podcasts replayed the clip as gospel. And through it all, Crockett never claimed the crown being handed to her. She didn't declare herself a hero. She didn't cash in. She simply kept showing up. Not louder, but deeper. Each appearance wasn't a tour. It was a continuation of the sentence she had started in that hearing room, when she had drawn a line around cruelty and dared the country to call it what it was. And so the name stuck. the thunder in a season of lies. Not because she was loud, but because she was inevitable. Because she didn't arrive with flash. She arrived with force. Because when the air was thick with denial, her words were the pressure change that couldn't be ignored. And in a nation addicted to noise, it was her silence. Deliberate, commanding, unshakable, that reminded everyone what truth actually sounds like. After the interviews faded, after the headlines cooled and Congress moved on to safer topics, what remained wasn't a debate, it was a wound. And into that wound, a voice returned. Not to reopen it, but to make sure the scar meant something. The screen begins in absolute black. No title card, no network watermark, no sound. Just the vast, quiet nothingness. The kind that forces you to lean in, to wonder if your screen has frozen, or if something's about to begin that will not let go of you. Then a single sound pierces it. Breath. Human. Steady. Not theatrical. The unmistakable sound of someone preparing to say something that costs something. A moment later, Jasmine Crockett's voice arrives. Not booming, not righteous. Calm, low, like someone speaking to a room of one. There is no music behind her, no flash, no framing. Only this. If a wandering child is called the enemy, her tone draws the sentence out like a thread pulled from cloth. Then who, a pause so sharp it cuts, really threatens the American dream? The silence afterward is deafening, but it's not a void. It's an indictment against everything that has pretended to be patriotism, against every policy that called itself law while dressing up cruelty and bureaucracy, against every official who ever whispered security while meaning exclusion. And then, slowly, deliberately, white words begin to fade onto the center of the screen. The letters don't animate. They appear as if they've always been there, just waiting for the world to catch up. Truth doesn't need to shout. It only needs to refuse to be silent. The font is plain, sans serif, no logo, no signature. Because this isn't about a party, or a brand, or even a person. It's about what was left behind after all the shouting stopped, and the silence finally had the courage to speak. The line hangs on the screen like a final breath, held just a second longer than comfort allows. And it stays. Long enough to feel real, long enough to hurt, long enough to make you remember why silence, when chosen by the oppressed, is resilience. But when chosen by the powerful, is complicity. There is no music, no montage, no credits, only black, only stillness. And then the screen fades not to white, but to darkness again. Not to erase, but to remind. Because sometimes the loudest thing in a broken country isn't a chant or a headline. It's a whisper that refused to die, a sentence that didn't blink, a voice that didn't climb, but cut, and a truth that didn't ask to be heard, only refused to go unspoken. And for millions who watch that screen alone, in kitchens, in buses, in waiting rooms, in silence, that truth did not just land. It stayed. The screen may have gone dark, but something brighter remained. Not in policy, not in applause, but in the quiet knowledge that something sacred had been reclaimed. The real lesson wasn't written in the congressional record. It wasn't captured in a headline or reduced to a viral clip. It was written in the stillness that came afterward. The breathless space where the nation, for one rare second, remembered what compassion sounds like when it finally refuses to whisper. Jasmine Crockett didn't win because she yelled louder. She didn't triumph because she had more power. She turned the tide because she chose principle over popularity and clarity over comfort. In a room engineered for political theater, she delivered something more dangerous. A mirror, one that forced the country to see the difference between defending a border and destroying a soul. That was the lesson, that dignity is not a line item, that justice doesn't wear a uniform, that a child in a cage doesn't need credentials to be called human, and that silence, the most common currency of complicity, is always louder in the aftermath of cruelty. But it was also a lesson about something deeper, about the cost of empathy in a system designed to punish it. about what it takes to remain human while surrounded by power that has forgotten how. Jasmine Crockett didn't just confront a secretary, she confronted a nation's moral amnesia. She didn't argue for politics. She made a case for memory, for the kind of remembering that hurts, that refuses to flatten pain into policy. She reminded everyone watching that the question isn't whether we have the right to detain children. The question is, who do we become when we do? Her words weren't strategy, they were scars made audible, and in making them audible, she made them undeniable. For millions of viewers who had never been seen by the institutions that claimed to serve them, Crockett's defiance wasn't just inspiring, it was permission. Permission to grieve, to speak, to reclaim the parts of themselves that had been disfigured by systems that called cruelty procedure. The woman from Honduras whose words shook a nation, she wasn't an exception. She was a reminder that behind every file labeled detained minor, there is a bedtime story left unfinished, a birthday missed, a scream buried beneath legal terms. And Jasmine didn't just speak for them. She forced the system to listen, to witness, to remember, even if only for a moment. The human lesson didn't end when the bill was pulled. It didn't end when Kristi Noem walked out. It began when people who had grown numb began to feel again, when indifference, once a shield, became a shame, and when silence, which had once protected the powerful, turned against them. Jasmine Crockett showed the country that resistance isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a voice that doesn't flinch. Sometimes it's truth delivered without decoration. Sometimes it's a woman standing still while the machinery of a nation tries to erase her and fails. And most haunting of all, most unforgettable, is what she left us with. The reminder that justice will never shout over injustice. It will simply outlast it. Because the truest revolution doesn't always come in thunder. Sometimes it comes in someone saying, "No, not this time, not in my name," and meaning every word. But reflection alone has never been enough. And Jasmine Crockett did not fight to make us feel. She fought to make us move. The final image may have faded. The broadcast may have ended. But the truth she unleashed doesn't live in headlines or hearings. It lives in what we do next. Because what was exposed inside the chamber wasn't just one woman's prejudice or one law's cruelty. It was a blueprint for how injustice hides behind flags, podiums, and polished rhetoric. Now it's your turn. Your turn to decide whether that story ends with applause or action. Not everyone can speak into a congressional mic, but everyone can raise their voice where silence once reigned. Start with your vote. Start with your voice. Start with your refusal to accept a system that treats children as threats and dignity as a luxury. Because if injustice learned to dress itself in law, then justice must become our daily resistance. Do not wait for permission to care. Do not wait for the next scandal to be outraged. The fight Jasmine waged in that room was never meant to stay there. It was meant to follow you home, to your city hall, to your school board, to your dinner table. Because injustice thrives in abstraction, but it dies when people get specific. Find the name of the bill, the district of the lawmaker, the next vote on the calendar. Don't repost, don't just react. Organize, register, volunteer, donate, show up, not once, not for the optics, but again and again, until what happened to that mother from Honduras is unthinkable, not inevitable. Until the phrase Guantanamo for migrants becomes a shameful memory, not a legislative possibility. Let this moment be more than a memory. Let it be a fault line, the kind that shakes loose apathy and forces the foundation to crack. You don't need to be famous to make noise. You don't need a platform to protect someone. You just need to act like the truth matters more than your comfort. Ask your representatives what they're doing. Ask your school what it teaches. Ask your police what they've learned. Because every time we choose not to ask, we tell injustice it can stay. But here is what history teaches us. If we dare to listen, no system dismantles itself. No policy softens without pressure. And no country heals without accountability. Jasmine Crockett didn't stand up to be remembered. She stood up so no one would forget who paid the price when we stayed quiet. She didn't win with volume or vengeance. She won with vision, a vision that requires all of us to carry it forward, not for applause, not for attention, but for survival, for those still caged, for those still voiceless, for those whose names will never make the news. This is the part where we stop watching and start doing. This is the moment where we decide whether we will be the ones history will thank or the ones it will indict, because every generation gets one defining test of conscience, and this is ours. It doesn't come with banners or anthems. It comes in the quiet decision to act when it would be easier not to. It comes when we stand up for people we will never meet, because no child should have to prove they are human to be treated like one. It comes when we realize that democracy is not a gift we inherit, but a responsibility we choose, again and again, in the face of fear. So take the rage you felt watching that hearing and do something with it. Take the disbelief and the heartbreak and the fire that lit inside you and move. Don't wait for someone else. Be the someone else. Be the one who writes to Congress. Be the one who calls out the lie. Be the one who tells the truth even when it costs you. Be the thunder in your own community, the force that breaks silence, the voice that doesn't tremble. They will tell you it doesn't matter, that you're too small, that you're too late. Don't believe them. Jasmine Crockett was one woman in one room against a machine built to ignore her, and she still broke through. So can you. They will tell you to calm down, to wait your turn, to let the system fix itself. But if the system could fix itself, we wouldn't have children behind razor wire and mothers dying with their stories untold. This is not about charity. It's about solidarity. It's about building something no tear gas, no talking point, and no border wall can erase. A country that finally recognizes the humanity it tried so hard to forget. So register, vote, march, speak, protect, uplift, defend. Not in theory, but in action. Not in temporary outrage, but in permanent resolve. Because the real revolution doesn't start when the cameras roll. It starts when you decide the story will not end with someone else's silence. It starts now, and it starts with you. Thank you for watching until this moment, and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below, and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.